All right. So as I was preparing for this talk, I was trying to sort of think about um, the angle I wanted to take with it, and sort of what I wanted to discuss with you all. And um, a lot of my thinking on this topic started when I was a speech therapist in a middle school in Memphis, and seeing as how this is a clinic, um, I I think the uh, sort of the clinical application of what we're going to be talking about today is sort of something I always want to be returning to, not only for therapists but for people who stutter to be thinking about um, in their own lives. And when I was introducing myself, I mentioned that sort of like the big thing I'm interested in is is how we experience moments of stuttering and what affects this experience. Um, Sometimes those effects are psychological, right? How we feel about our stuttering, but sometimes those effects are social. So how does the person we're talking to feel about stuttering, right? Um, and those things aren't that separate, right? Like we internalize um, what other people are feeling, and other people internalize what we're feeling. So there's this back and forth between the personal and the social. Um, so I think where I want to start is I'm hoping that this talk can be sort of conversational, and we could sort of arrive at some conclusions together as a group. Um, so I just want to start by asking a question, and that is, what's it like to stutter? Like, what do you feel when you're stuttering? And then once I hear from y'all, I'll talk about what the the consensus from the research where they've been asking people who stutter, what is stuttering like, and then I want to expand on that. So what is your stuttering like? What do you feel when you stutter?
Well, for me personally, I think it feels like a little struggle, kind of a well, well, like a lag time between my thought and like my vocals, my vocalization actually saying it. Um, so it's something that takes a lot of, for me, it's patience and a lot of resilience on the day to day.
Right. I like that you use that word struggle because it almost implies something that's active, right? Like it's not like you're speaking, this thing happens and then it stops and then you go on. It's more like something you need to wrestle with
Yeah,
almost.
yeah. Some days for sure.
Right. How about
So,
some others?
so for me, it feels like I guess I can give the analogy to football training with those uh, wind parachutes on your back, and you're trying to get to the end zone, and it's a tension pull towards the end zone. You have the parachute on your back.
There was that reminds me, there is this, I was in the airport a couple weeks ago, and there was this little boy walking the wrong way on the moving sidewalk,
Huh.
and he was putting all this effort into walking and just wasn't getting anywhere. um he seemed to be enjoying himself though.
Yeah. I don't always enjoy it though. So.
Yeah. Okay, so there's this sense of struggle, there's this sense of effort, right? What else?
there's sorry, there's
Yeah.
also a a deep shame element.
Mm.
Like I should be able to just talk because it's a common thing that everyone's kind of born with. No one thinks about talking.
Right, right. So in addition to the physicality of stuttering, there's this emotional component that unfortunately, or maybe depending on the emotion, fortunately, accompanies it. I want to ask the fluent people in the room, what would you imagine stuttering to feel like?
If I may.
Yeah, fluent person.
Do we call them fluenters?
Yeah, I'm the fluent person. For me, I feel like there's a deep avoidancy of going out in everyday life and imagining just holding down a conversation, whether it be a passerby, whether it be someone at work, whether it be a family member, just having that urgency of just being going out and saying whatever I want to say, but from someone that has a stutter, just being so frustrated of trying to come across like they don't stutter, or trying to just say what they internally feel. And that
Right.
to me is difficult.
So stuttering isn't just present when you're stuttering, right? There's this sort of carryover effect into maybe moments even when you're not stuttering, but also even when you're not even speaking, right? It might affect the decisions that you make and the things that you do. So when researchers go out and they ask people, you know, what is stuttering like? Some of the words that emerge from that data are, like, the big ones are struggle, loss of control, and getting stuck. And I think sort of what these all imply is this sort of active moment of trying to get something done that's not cooperating. And you guys all sort of express that in one way or another. And sort of where I was hoping this conversation would go, and you guys played right into my plans, is that almost everything you guys said was negative, right? Everything about the stuttering experience that we've outlined so far is something I feel like most people probably don't want to experience. And so why do we think it's so much easier to come up with negative experiences of stuttering than, not, it doesn't have to be positive, but just like neutral descriptors of what stuttering is like?
Well, I have a theory.
Yeah.
Part of my theory is this idea that I think because frankly, as a fluent person, we take it for granted. And that to me has been, that it's as simple as that. I think it's this idea that if you stutter, while of course you can see, light through it, I think the idea of people giving negative attributes, again, is because people who stutter are not given the ability to take for granted something that 99% of the population is able to take for granted.
Right. They're not, I think you hit the nail on the head that they're a characteristic of who they are isn't allowed to be neutral, right? It's not allowed to be normal, and therefore when you're thinking about it, you don't necessarily think about it in a holistic way. You're sort of focusing on the bad aspects of it, right? It's only pointed out to you in a negative connotation.
You know, and frankly, taking something for granted doesn't mean only good anyway. But I think, again, it's this idea that a fluent person doesn't have to work at it. You know, doesn't have to, you know, you can still be nervous about speaking, but you're not going to be worried about if you're going to be able to actually get the sound.
Right.
That is unique to the stuttering experience.
Right.
So I can't help but think that, of course, a person who stutters is going to look over at a fluent person and say, oh, how could life not be easier if I could just take this for granted?
Right. So something that is, I'm gonna rearrange how I was gonna present some of my material, because I think we just touched on something interesting, and that is there's this seeming common sense connection between our stuttering and perhaps our ability to communicate and our quality of life. However, a lot of our research has shown that how much you stutter does not necessarily correlate with how much stuttering affects you, right? So I think the two like really popular measures that researchers will use are something called the stuttering severity instrument, which is basically a measure of how frequently and how long your stutters are. And then the AIS, which is a self-survey instrument that looks at how much stuttering is impacting you negatively. And in many studies, including a lot of my own, those two things don't correlate, right? So how frequently you're stuttering and how long those stutters are. So like the physical severity of the stuttering is seemingly unrelated to, you can't use that to guess, oh, this person is really affected by their stutter and this person isn't, right? There are some people who stutter, who have a lot of physical stuttering who seem unaffected, and some people who have very minimal physical stuttering who are greatly affected. I was looking at, I'm in some of my work, I'm trying to develop a measure of ease of speaking that I'm calling spontaneity, right? So it's looking at, you know, how physically difficult is it for you to get your words out, regardless of whether you're stuttering, right? So how I conceive of spontaneity is a combination of physical effort and mental attention, right? So if speaking requires little physical effort and little mental effort, mental attention, then it's fairly spontaneous. If it requires a lot of physical effort and thinking about speech, then it's not spontaneous, it's effortful. And what I found was that while frequency of stuttering doesn't predict AIS score, so it doesn't predict life impact, how effortful stuttering is does. So how, if you can stutter a lot, but if they're spontaneous stutters, if they're easy stutters, if you're not thinking about it, they don't seem to affect you very much. And you can stutter a tiny little bit, but if they demand your attention, if they're physically difficult, then it seems to impact your life more. And so I guess my next question for everybody is, are there moments when you're stuttering where you don't feel all those things that you were talking about earlier, where you don't feel struggle and you don't feel stuck and you don't feel those negative connotations? When are you stuttering when you don't feel those things, if ever?
Yeah, Chris, me, for sure there are times that I stutter and I don't realize it. It's just part of me. It's a lighter stutter. And I feel that I probably don't feel all of the mental part of it and the stressful part of it. Probably when I'm around certain people, that it's natural for me, you know, friends, family, and that stuff. I'm a 55, so looking here, I think it's pretty safe to say that I've stuttered in most of this audience in this room because I'm older than most of the people here, or actually, I'm sorry, everybody here.
Not me.
So you don't get it. So I've stuttered 50 plus years. So that's a lot of miles. And I just wrote a couple of notes down because I've never heard it. And it makes sense, physical effort and mental attention. Those for me are the two aspects of it. I think Mark talked a lot about the physical effort part of it. That gets tough on me when I'm in a situation or a day in my daily life that's just taking a lot of work, a lot of talking, a lot of dealing in an environment that's not my own home, my own work. When I'm there, I don't stutter much because I'm comfortable. But in the days that I force myself to be in other environments or working like makes me be like a room of people, you know, strangers, and speaking, I find myself not necessarily during the speech, unless I get really blocked. It's at the end. I find myself at the end of the day, as all of us have, exhausted.
Right.
And I'm married 20 plus years, and that's a part of my life that my wife, I have to tell her sometimes when I've worked, I've been out, you know, 12 hours, 14 hours, and the amount of mental attention it took to get through that day that a fluid person doesn't deal with. I've at times have to remind her that I'm exhausted just doing something that most people do naturally, like walking, you know? So, I mean, that's just, I'm on a tangent there a little bit, but what was the question?
No, I think you touched on something that's important. So what I'm about to say isn't proven, so don't write it down. But stuttering is, I mean, speaking is one of the most complex motor tasks that humans do, right? And the way other motor tasks work is when you're learning them, let's say you're doing something simple like shooting a basketball. When you're learning it, you have to use what they call working memory, which is sort of your conscious ruminating ability to think about what you're doing, right? And then once you learn the motor plan, it switches over to procedural memory, which is basically automatic, right? You actually lose the ability to teach it well, right? If you try to teach somebody how to ride a bicycle, it's really, really difficult. People who are in the midst of learning something are often better teachers than those who have already mastered it, because it's still available to them in working memory. And what the research on choking, so like not choking like in your throat, but choking like going to shoot a foul shot and missing it during the big game, a lot of that research has shown that what's happening is athletes are taking motor plans that should be performed procedurally and are performing them using their working memory, right? They're overriding what they already know how to do, and because they're nervous and are trying to take conscious control of this behavior, and are messing it up, right? Because it's harder to perform that way. And now the part that's not proven is I like to think about stuttering as sort of operating in a similar fashion, right? You were talking about how when you're at home, you're not really thinking about stuttering, and actually you don't seem to struggle as much, right? You do stutter, but they're probably easier and lighter, and they don't demand your attention as much. They're almost happening automatically. But then when it matters, right, it's almost like we're overriding the system, and are trying to use our conscious ability to work through speech. And so I think the challenge for therapy, right, is, and I think this is where a lot of speech therapy runs into trouble, is it seems like the more we think about our stuttering, like the harder it is, right? The more we worry about it, the more we are concerned about it, the harder it is to speak, right? And so how do you teach somebody to not care about their speech, right? If you're teaching them to hit targets, right? If you're teaching them to be forever paying attention to the sounds that are coming out of their mouths, you're basically teaching them to always be using working memory to talk, right? And that doesn't seem like a promising way to help somebody speak easier. And so I mentioned when I first started talking that some of these things I started thinking about were while I was a speech therapist in a middle school, and I had all these middle school stutterers who I was trying to help to, they wanted nothing more than to not stutter, right? They were struggling, they were self-conscious, they didn't want to be stuttering. And what I had to offer them was so let's get comfortable stuttering so it's easier. And they wanted nothing to do with that approach, as you can imagine, right? So what I started thinking about was, it's easier for people to let themselves stutter if they have a reason to stutter, right? If stuttering is not simply something bad, right? If it's not simply something we grin and bear, if there's something good that comes out of the experience of stuttering, then it's probably, or it will be, easier for these kids to let themselves stutter. And then not only do they get that sort of positive thing that happens in that moment, but theoretically they should be stuttering easier and with less struggle and less effort. So I started exploring ways to think about stuttering and ways to think about disability that might help come up with reasons to stutter, right? Reasons that stuttering might not be the worst thing in the world. So as we transition to talking about that, I think where I want to start is just how we talk about disability. And I think when you talk about disability in the stuttering world, it can get kind of contentious, because I think the way a lot of people cope with their stuttering, and this isn't an unhealthy way of coping, but it does get in the way of this conversation, is that they decide they're not going to let their stuttering get in their way, right? That they're not going to see their stuttering as something wrong with them. They're just going to power through life. And to see their stuttering as a disability would be a step backwards in how they're coping about stuttering, right? Because their whole means of proceeding forward has been to act like nothing's wrong. And they don't want to talk about their stuttering in a negative light. And so what I want to do is sort of open up how we're thinking about disability, and move it from something that has to be necessarily negative to just a description of a process that's happening. So before we get into like different models of disability, I want to hear like where we're coming from when we think about disability. So how would some of you define disability?
Well, I guess for me, you know, in the generic sense, it's having trouble doing something that the majority of people don't struggle with.
Okay, I think that's a good definition. Are there any other ways of understanding the disability?
Yeah, for me, when I think it like it comes across as like some physical dysfunction that affects on like a quality of life for someone.
Right. Okay. So I think this is good. The ways that we're defining disability sort of imply that it's something inherent to a person's body that we assume lowers their quality of life in some way, right? And I think this is sort of the most common way of understanding disability, and it's often called the medical model of disability, right? It assumes sort of a ideal able-bodied type person, and that anything that detracts from that person's abilities is considered a disability. So that sort of situates disability in biology, right? There's something biologically wrong going on, and therefore the way to help somebody with a disability is to either try to cure it, right, through medicine or surgery, or if you can't cure it, then at least rehabilitate it, treat it through some sort of therapeutic means. So we're going to be talking about different models of disability. I don't want to, I think sometimes people treat these discussions like a sporting event where you have to like pick a side and root for that team. Different models of disability are just different ways of understanding phenomena, right? And sometimes one model is more appropriate than the other. And so what I want to introduce is a model called the social model, which basically assumes there is no ideal body type, right? But there are different types of bodies. And what makes a social model different from the medical model is that rather than disability being a biological fact, it's an active process that occurs in society, right? So disability doesn't depend on one's body. Rather, it depends on whether one's body is easily accommodated by the environment that one lives in. So when we're thinking about our environment, much of our environment is a built environment, right? You guys are all sitting in a room, in a building, in a city, right? That was designed by humans with a certain type of human in mind. Years and years ago, before the American with Disabilities Act, right? Often people who had trouble walking were not taken into account, right? There was no wheelchair ramps. There wasn't even breaks in the curbs of sidewalks. Elevators weren't mandatory in all buildings. And so it's these social processes that would disable somebody in a wheelchair, right? When that person is accommodated, their life is pretty close to what a person walking life would be. When they don't have access to a ramp, then life can be very, very difficult. A lot of the disability research shows that people with disabilities, this is called the disability paradox, actually. People with disabilities often do not have a lower quality of life than non-disabled people. When they do, the causes are not usually the disability itself, but lack of access to accommodation, right? So stuff like not having access to adequate healthcare, or not having access to ramps to roll your wheelchair up. And so what I want us to think about is, are there ways in which your stuttering is not accommodated by the society that you live in? I'm gonna talk about some examples from the research, but I want to hear about any examples from your lives.
I know for me, sometimes it's not accommodated in ways of just seeing people speaking in a different way. I think going in for casting directors and directors, they see a certain way of how somebody speaks, and it's the fluent model. And I think I am always going in needing to change minds as opposed to just doing my own best work.
Right. Okay. So there's, I would call that expectations of fluency, maybe, right?
That's
like you're expected to speak a certain way, and when you violate that expectation, you're treated differently.
Yeah.
Right. What I want, as you guys are thinking about this, something what I would like you to think about is sort of the difference between, say, ignorance and prejudice. Okay. I think the difference is that, let's say I was, and this is an insight that I was talking to a friend of mine who is Black, who grew up in Russia and who now lives in Florida. And she was telling me that when that her skin color was very much an issue when she was in Russia, right? People asked her questions all the time. It often came up in conversation, but she never felt like people were racist. She just felt like people were curious and had no idea about what, they had never seen a Black person before. She felt like when she moved to America, even though her skin color was no longer a big deal. That, I mean, in terms of like everyday conversations, like people didn't ask her, you know, why are you black? But she felt treated differently by, say, people in authority or job interviews and stuff like that, that she didn't experience when she was in Russia. And so I think when you think about your experiences, do you think these are experiences that just happen to you, or are they experiences that happen to a certain type of person, right? Are these just my experiences, or are these collective experiences of people who stutter?
For me, I'd say probably like the latter for people who stutter, not just me.
Right, right. I think the research clearly points this out, right? There's lots of studies that show that people who stutter, employers see them as less employable. They're seen as less competent. There's lots of stereotypes about them having low self-esteem. There's, I'm just scrolling through my notes, stereotypes about them always being nervous and anxious. And so when you're talking to somebody and you have that feeling like, I don't want to stutter because I don't want them to think less of me, I don't think that's an irrational thought, right? You're not being crazy, right? There's a reason we try not to stutter, right? And it's because we perceive that we're treated differently when we do. And so according to the social model of disability, regardless of whether you think your stuttering is a disability, right? Disability is more about how society treats you rather than what you think about yourself. So you can think, you know, maybe your stutter doesn't bother you whatsoever. But if there's a social consequence to stuttering, then I would say it should still be considered a disability. And so I want to circle back to when I asked you to describe stuttering to me, and most of our descriptions were negative. And not only were they negative, but they were sort of these effortful sort of descriptions, right? And we even talked about how much easier it is to speak when we're not worried about stuttering, right? When we're at home, when we're talking to loved ones, when there's no consequence, right? That's sort of how I like to see those situations. When I talk to people at, say, groups like this, where there's a lot of people who stutter, or like National Stuttering Association get-togethers, whether that's the conference or the local group meetings. The reason why those get-togethers feel so different is because there's no consequence to stuttering, right? This is like the perfect proof of contextual factors directly affecting how our stuttering feels to ourselves. And so I think that as we're thinking about how stuttering feels, we have to remember that how it feels might not be inherent to stuttering, but may be susceptible to the context in which we're stuttering. And so I want to sort of backtrack a little bit to the work I was talking about on spontaneity, that I think that sort of supports what I'm talking about. That my work showed that it's possible to stutter spontaneously, right? That people report stuttering with very little effort without thinking about it. People also report stuttering with a ton of effort and major thinking about it, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. And I would argue that a lot of the reason it is that way is because of how other people treat us when we stutter. So we talked about this. I think I mentioned that I don't think one model of disability is necessarily right or wrong. I think the medical model of disability is really helpful if you're trying to cure a disease, right? I hope the people working on coronavirus vaccines are using the medical model. But when you're thinking about complex social interactions and why we behave the way that we do, why do our bodies feel the way that they feel? I think the social model can be really helpful. And I think it can be empowering to think that, you know, how I feel when I speak might not be inherent to my stuttering, but may be a consequence of social factors. Because then you can start to think, okay, if my stuttering doesn't have to feel bad, if my stuttering doesn't have to feel shameful, that sort of opens up all these other possibilities of how it can feel. And so that brings me to I guess the third concept I want to talk about, which is neurodiversity, which is a concept that started in the autism world. And it's a bit different from the social model because it doesn't suggest that disability necessarily comes from society. Some of it may indeed be biological, but rather it encourages us to reject sort of a graded view of one body is better than another, it's better than a different body, right? It suggests that diversity amongst different types of bodies is good for a population, just like biodiversity is good for an ecosystem, right? So it encourages us to think about disability as adding to society rather than taking away from it. I think that's sort of easy to think about at a population level, right? It's easy to think about how diversity might be good. It gives us different perspectives and allows us to see different types of experiences. I think it's harder to think about on the personal level, right? It's almost like, yeah, I'd rather lots of other people be diverse, but I don't necessarily want to be diverse myself. So I think the challenge then is how do we think about stuttering, or how do we stutter in ways that don't disable us, that might be positive. I have some ideas on this matter, but I don't know that my ideas are always relatable to other people. So I want to start by what some of your ideas might be. If you were to think about stuttering in a way that's, so how I like to pose this question, because I think we often get bogged down in thinking about let me restart myself. What I often ask is, what do we gain from stuttering? Okay. And how people often answer that question is by saying what they gained because stuttering was difficult. Okay. So that's what they gained by overcoming stuttering, right? That sort of positions stuttering as a hardship. And what they gain is, say, perseverance, a sense of maybe they're not as vain as they would be. Maybe they care less about other people's opinions. Maybe they have a sense of what it means to really work hard. And those are all good qualities, right? I'm not taking that away from anybody, but that's not actually what I'm trying to get at with this question. What I want us to think about together is, In the moment that you're actually stuttering, right? While you're stuck, maybe, or while you feel your lips catch or your tongue maybe linger on the roof of your mouth. Is there anything gained in that moment? Is there anything that you have in that moment that you wouldn't have if you didn't stutter? I think this is an important question, because if we can answer it, I think that gives us reasons to stutter more. And I think that makes our stuttering more spontaneous. I think it keeps it in procedural memory rather than switching it over to working memory. So I want you guys to struggle to answer that question for a couple of minutes, and then I'll share the answers that I've come up with.
For me, when we were all introducing ourselves, I felt like I got pretty stuck. And I wasn't having that effortless stuttering. It was a little tiny bit panic. That then switched to a feeling of connection to you guys. Like, that was very important. And I think that happens to me a lot when I struggle. I remember my stuttering community, and it brings up like remembering that this is a big part of me, and I still stutter, and it sort of makes the moment about more than just the struggle. It's like I'm having connection to the people in my life who stutter, and kind of also all the work that I done to kind of switch out of that fear and that shame to like, oh, maybe this is okay. I don't know. It's some that I have this like internal conversation with myself in the moment of stuttering, if it's like a big one, which I guess is cool. That I don't think people who don't stutter have a reminder of this, this is a special part of their lives when they're just talking. You know what I mean?
I think is that sort of analogous to how you might have a cultural, like a reminder of your culture, if you have an accent, or if you have just something that when you do it, whether it's something that you say or something that you wear or something that you practice, sort of reminds you of things that you care about.
Yeah, I guess I don't have a connection to like another thing in my life where that happened. I have to think about that. But it definitely happens with stuttering, especially when it's like a large, effortful stutter. It just, I have all these memories that like flash before my eyes of like, this used to happen to me when I was a kid, and I felt like as ashamed as humanly possible, and like, but now I'm actually continuing to talk, even though I just had that big stutter. Like, I guess that's pretty cool. I don't know. I just think there is some benefit to having an effortful stutter for me, in that it's like a reminder, like that part of my identity, and how for the most part I've embraced that part of my identity, and it like forces me to remember that. I don't know.
Yeah. I think actually you sort of touched on where I was going to go with this. Is one of the reasons I'm so interested in this question is that question of identity. So what I'm currently researching is whether stuttering identity functions like other forms of identity. So how other forms of identity tend to work, whether it's gender or race or religion or sexual orientation, is that if you have an identity that makes you different, and that identity is made salient in a context. So let's say you're the only person of a certain race in the room, right? And it's pointed out to you. Let's say you're in Russia and somebody asks you why your skin is the color that it is. If you have a high private regard, like you think highly of that aspect of yourself, when your identity characteristic is made salient, often you experience an emotional boost, right? You feel good about yourself in that situation. If you have a low private regard for that identity characteristic, then generally when that identity, and seems like common sense, when that identity characteristic is pointed out, you generally have a psychological penalty, right? You feel worse about yourself in that situation. And so my research question is does having a high private regard for stuttering lead to psychological boosts when stuttering is made salient in given situations, right? If I think highly of being a person who stutters and my stutter is pointed out to me, do I experience any sort of psychological boost? What's kind of cool about stuttering is it can be made salient just by doing it, right? So like as Crystal was pointing out, when she has a hard stutter, like that's making her stutter salient to her, right? And she just sort of confirmed my thesis, right? That she experiences a little boost there, right? Because her stutter doesn't bother her that much. She thinks good of it. It's almost like every time she stutters, she gets this little jolt of dopamine or something. So that's sort of the if stuttering is allowed to be a normal human trait, if it's allowed to function like every other human trait functions, then there should be both negative and positive parts of it. And it seems like currently stuttering is restricted to the negative. That people really struggle to think about it in any sort of a neutral or positive light. And so that's why I think conversations like these are so important, just to, even if we can't come up with any answers, just to sort of open the door to thinking about it like that. Does anybody else want to add to what Crystal said?
Well, what's challenging too is it's not just coming from social parameters. I think the debate and the struggle back and forth is also coming within our own community too. It's like, how do we take this disability? Is it a disability? Is it not a disability? Do we try to speak more fluently, more easily, or do we teach more spontaneity and acceptance? And it's challenging when our own top researchers and people in our own community aren't on the same page. So how do we expect society to also be on that page as well?
Yeah, I think that's right, in that we talk a lot in stuttering research about self-stigma. So how I was talking about the sort of prejudice that exists in society earlier, but people who stutter internalize that stigma, right? So we are not immune from the same prejudices that everybody else also carries, right? I think it works the other way too, right? If the stuttering community is not on the same page about whether where we are on how we feel about our own stuttering, society is not going to pick up any sort of coherent message from us either, right? I think the more we can present a face to society that says this is okay, how I talk is okay, then the less stigma there will be. Yeah. Does anybody else want to take a whack at answering that hard question of what might be a good thing that happens when we stutter?
I feel like for me, something that I really have come to appreciate is, I really try to value connection with other people and authentic connection with another person. And I think something about stuttering that has, I'm really starting to appreciate this more as I've, gotten older, but it kind of reminds me that communication is the vehicle to that. It's sort of, when I'm meeting somebody or having a conversation with someone close to me, I'm reminded that I'm communicating with another human being right now. And I think it makes me more present to the concept that I'm living out my value by making that decision to communicate. I'm not becoming complacent in just the script of everyday communication that I think most people kind of fall into. And I feel like that's been something I'm really grateful that, and genuinely grateful for that.
Yeah, I want, that was actually one of the things I was going to talk about, is that I think a gain that we get from stuttering is this sort of forced, these sort of forced moments of connection, where, and a lot of times we're going through our lives and we have these sort of automatic conversations with other people, right? There's, as you just said, they're sort of scripted, right? You have these sort of things that you say, hi, how are you doing? Doing well, thank you, whatever, back and forth, where you're not actually talking to a human being. You're sort of just robots changing these scripts. And stuttering throws a wrench in those scripts, right? You see it on the other person's face, where they sort of freeze and look at you wide-eyed, like, what's happening here? Why are you not responding in the way that I expected you to respond? I was at a Cuban restaurant for lunch, and I was stuttering a lot with my waitress, and we had way more conversation than we would have had if I hadn't been stuttering, because she was in a rush, right? She was trying to just go through the motions, and not that I was trying to not let her go through the motions, but my stutter didn't let her go through the motions, right? I kept getting stuck, so she would start walking off and realize I was still talking to her and come back, right? And then we would talk, and it was, I'm sure, it kind of sounds like I'm torturing her because she was in a rush, but I found it very nice. I think she found it nice. The amount of times that my stuttering has turned automatic interactions into real conversations is hard to keep track of, because it happens very often.
Chris, I'm going to jump in here because I think that there is a lot to gain from stuttering. And I also think that the question, what is there to gain, really comes after the fact that we've identified ourselves with high regard as being a person who stutters. And so I want to create some space for some of us who might not actually be able to be in that zone to say, what can I gain? Because the experience of stuttering is so frustrating and or traumatic, and that's a whole different conversation, like that feeling of hijacking of the body, so that you're not even engaged or have that courage or determination to continue talking to the waitress and staying there. So I just wanted to put that out there.
No, I think that's important, and I think that's I want to continue to go back to those middle schoolers, right? I think that unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever you want to look at this, the fact of the matter is that we do not have a way to not stutter, right? There is, as far as we know, no way to get rid of stuttering. And so I think the battle is that we currently live in a society that's quite hostile to difference. Our stutter is routinely punished, and we don't want to do it frequently, right? And so what we do know from therapy, from research, is that one way to speak easier is to stop fighting the stuttering so much, right? Is to do our best to let ourselves stutter. That said, given everything we just talked about, that's really freaking hard, right? Like that's like the hardest thing in the world because there's so many consequences to stuttering. And so I often get sort of this pushback when I talk about these things that, you know, I don't see my stuttering as a good thing. I don't want to stutter. I don't relate to what you're saying. And I don't think you have to, but you're still going to stutter, right? That doesn't change the fact that you're stuttering. And so we might as well try to, we already have all these reasons not to, right? We have all these reasons not to stutter, and they're good reasons. They're rational reasons. I'm not saying those reasons are wrong, but if we can put, so that's our like con list. We have a pro con list. We have all these reasons in our con list not to stutter. I think it behooves us to try to put a little bit in our pro list, because I think that makes it easier to stutter. And I think the easier it is to stutter, the less we struggle. So I don't want to deny the experience of people having a hard time, because I mean, that's why there's therapists. That's why we're even talking about stuttering, right? If stuttering wasn't difficult for people, it wouldn't be interesting and we wouldn't be talking about it, right? The reason we're all here tonight is because stuttering can be really, really, really hard. And I don't want to deny that. I just think that if we can sort of work to undermine that a little bit, come up with some reasons to lean into our stuttering, that stuttering gets a little easier.
Sometimes for me, it gives me a sense, ironically, a sense of control of my own space and my own time. And if I think of it in a positive way, if I do get blocked, think of it in that sense of like, oh, this time is mine. And I think that that's a really powerful tool just of self-confidence and of just dedication to what you're doing in life.
Yeah, I think it's that's interesting thing to think about, that like you don't have to be at the mercy of other people's time. In fact, your stuttering won't allow you to be, right? Because it sort of has a mind of its own. If you let it, it can be sort of it can give you a sense of agency. Yeah, Crystal.
I just I appreciated that you mentioned internalized stigma. I think that was really important to me when because I used to hear all these things, people would say, oh, society thinks this, society thinks this, and I'd be like, well, it's not society's fault. But then the idea that I think this because I'm a part of society, I also think that I'm less than because I have a disability, because I stutter. So I don't know, that was like for me a big light bulb, that the reason why just letting yourself stutter is hard is because you think those things too. You think I'm less than because this is not, a positive thing to have. And so I feel like a lot of the work that I did in speech therapy was kind of doing things like voluntary stuttering or just letting myself stutter, which I used to just avoid, and like realizing that the things that I thought about stuttering might not be so true. And it's so hard to change those internalized negative feelings about disability because it is such a big part of our society. Like you said, Chris, it's just people think that if you struggle with something physically, then that's not good, and I experienced that both with stuttering and CP, and so it's kind of a big deal to fight that in your own head, in your own life. So I think what you said, Chris, about how everything has positives and negatives, if it's just a human trait, I think that's true about like disability too. And I think what Hai is saying is important because no one's always gonna feel like this is amazing. You don't always get that dopamine rush you said, Chris. But when I do, it's pretty cool because it's a lot of work. And yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to say again about the internalized ableism piece because for me personally, yeah, I don't know, just an important thing to realize. And it's internalized everything, like internalized, what's it called when you feel less than because you're a woman? Internalized sexism? I don't know. It's just like there are all these things that you start to realize as you become an adult, like, oh, this is just a thing that I'm dealing with, like everybody is too. But to make your life better, you can like think about maybe that's not true.
And it's okay to be dealing with those things. Like I think sometimes in the stuttering community, we get this idea that like if we've accepted our stuttering, we'll never feel shame about it and we'll never try to avoid it. And then when we do avoid and we do feel bad, we like beat ourselves up over it. That's not how being a human being works, right? Like you don't just reach this state of enlightenment and just sort of like cruise through your life because you've figured everything out, right? Like there's as long as, so even in an ideal world, stuttering would be hard sometimes, right? It sucks to not be able to say what you want to say when you want to say it, right? That's just how it is. Sometimes you don't want to stutter. And so it's okay to feel bad about stuttering. It's okay to be embarrassed when you go to speak and somebody judges you, right? That's just part of living in a complex society and being a complex human being. We don't have to be perfect. But I do think it's important that we interrogate those experiences and we think about, why did I feel the way that I felt? Is there any time I feel differently, right? When I'm stuttering in front of my significant other, do I feel any different than when I stutter in front of my boss? When I stutter with my best friend, does it feel any differently? When I stutter with other people who stutter, why does that feel so different than when I stutter with a stranger. And I think that when we ask ourselves those questions, it sort of helps us to open up the possibilities of what stuttering can mean. And I hope my hope is that that allows stuttering to sort of go from this negative character trait to just a normal part of your identity, and then it can have pluses and minuses just like any other part of your identity. Because I think right now for most people it just has minuses.
And also, like, since we're talking about identities, I think it's also like I think it's also like important to talk like how, like for me, like I kind of learned that like I shouldn't let stuttering like identity like influence my other like identities. So
Right.
So like my friends tell me like like I know like I realize that I get happier when the like when they tell me that I talk a lot, like or a stutter. So like I'd rather be someone, or like I feel happier, like when my friends tell me that I talk a lot, like I talk a lot, like like with my stutter, then like then I'd be a quiet person, So I think that I think just being true to yourself and not trying to let stutter like affect your other, like identity. So like so like I know that like I'm a social person, like social person, like I'm like loves to talk a lot. So like I try to so I still feel so like I kind of realize that I feel happier when my friends say that I still that I'm a person who talks a lot. Then I go. Yeah, then the person who's quiet because I'm scared to talk like stutter. Like I already hear like the latter for that, but I'm
Right.
still like I still like annoy like everyone by talking too much. But like I would still rather hear that than like that my friends tell me that girl like why are you so quiet today so.
Yeah, I think absolutely all of our identities intersect, right? And it's more complicated than just like I'm a person who stutters. I'm that. A couple of years ago, I was doing research on covert stuttering, and I was interviewing a bunch of different people about sort of why they hide their stuttering, how they hide their stuttering, and I was interviewing a woman in Memphis, and she basically like laid all of her identities out on the table and said, so basically when I must have asked her something like, what makes you hide your stuttering or something, and she said to me, I'm old, I'm fat, I'm black, I'm a Muslim, I can't stutter on top of all of that. And I said, okay. So, there's all these things that make up who we are. And if you feel, oh, she said she was a woman as well. So, she just named off all these things that, she gets grief for. And they all affect each other, right? Being a stutterer who is a guy is probably different experience than being a stutterer who's a girl. Being a stutterer who's white is probably different than being a stutterer who's black. I remember in my NSA group in Memphis, most of the other members were African American, and we talked a lot about how when they were growing up, because we were talking about sort of what we're talking about right now, how stuttering can be a path to vulnerability, right? How it can be a path to intimacy and connection with others when you're talking. At least that's sort of what I brought to the table. That was how I thought I gained from stuttering. That when I stutter, I sort of let my guard down. It's a way of allowing intimacy into a conversation. And what they shared with me was that, you know, now that they're adults, they could see that, but when they were growing up, like they couldn't show any weakness in their neighborhoods, right? They had to put up a hard front, and stuttering got in the way of that, right? So certainly, stuttering intersects with all of our identities, but I think that just makes it more complicated, right? That doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. It just makes it a little bit more difficult, but a little bit more nuanced. So I promised you I would give you my answer to this question of what do we gain when we stutter, and I just sort of did a little bit when I was referring back to that conversation I was having with my friends in Memphis. But I think when we stutter, right, one of the classic descriptions of stuttering is losing control, right? You temporarily lose control of your articulators, of your mouth and your tongue and your larynx. And I think I like to think about that as like temporarily, like all my clothes falling off, right? That like I'm temporarily stripped right there in front of a person, and that can be really embarrassing, right? As you can imagine, but it can also be intimate, right? You're like showing somebody who you really are, and I think that if we allow that to happen repeatedly over the course of a day, that we might have some embarrassing moments, but we also have moments where people reciprocate that in intimacy. We have moments where people see us and then they get naked with us, right? They allow themselves to let their guard down too. And I think stuttering can be an invitation to vulnerability if we allow it to be. So that's what I gained from my stuttering. But like I was saying, stuttering intersects with all the other different parts of you. So I can't tell you what you would gain from your stuttering. You have to figure that out for yourself. But I think if we all are able to do that, if we're all able to add a little bit more things in the pro list, that helps us stutter easier. And that also helps us decrease stigma in society, right? If we can give reasons to people for why we choose to speak, why we choose to stutter, if we can stutter with pride, I think that's contagious, and hopefully fluent people can see that too. Yeah, I'm nearing the end of my time here. I don't want to keep y'all later.
Well, no, thank you, Chris. That was great. I want to open this to everyone. If there's someone that wanted to share a thought, yet that they could do that now. Question or thought?
Yeah.
Okay. Well then, Chris, any final thoughts from you?
No, I think I've spoken my head off. I just want to say I enjoyed talking to everybody. I hope that I don't claim to have the answer to stuttering. I just hope maybe it was thought provoking and give you something to think about on your way home. I do think if we can come up with reasons to stutter, stuttering gets easier.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna press the stop recording button, and Chris, we'd love a picture with you, if that's okay. We're all gonna sit around the couch.
I have gotten